All right, welcome to another deep dive. Today, we're going to delve into the work of, well, he's kind of a mouthful, Kazimierz Twardowski,
Yeah, I always trip over that one.
but super important guy, Austrian-born, but made his mark in Polish philosophy. And of course, we can't talk about him without mentioning, the big influence, Franz Brentano.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Student of Brentano. Carried on that torch, you could say.
Went on to found the Lvov-Warsaw School. Big deal. And we're going to see why as we get into this.
Hugely influential, yeah. Especially when you look at how he kind of took some of Brentano's ideas and really sharpened them up.
Refine them, yeah. And that's what makes this deep dive so interesting. We're focusing on one of Twardowski's big contributions, the whole content versus object of presentations thing.
Ah, yes. Classic Twardowski.
It's, well, it can seem a bit, I don't know, fiddly at first glance. But trust me, it gets to the core of some really, really big philosophical questions.
Oh, absolutely. We're talking the foundations of meaning, intentionality, even how we wrap our heads around things that don't actually exist. Big stuff.
Right. I mean, when you put it like that.
And to guide us on this journey, we're mainly relying on the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on Twardowski. Really excellent resource.
Solid choice, yeah. So, mission for today. Grasping Twardowski's main insights and seeing how they matter. Especially, I'd say, for anyone out there who's interested in the nitty-gritty of meaning, how our minds connect to the world, that's intentionality for you, and what even counts as an object in philosophy. Ready to dive in?
Let's do it.
All right. So before we get to the content-object distinction, got to set the stage a bit. Can't talk about Twardowski without talking about
Brentano.
Got to start with the teacher. Because, well, one of Brentano's most famous ideas is this thing called intentionality.
Yeah, you got it. It's like the heart and soul of his philosophy.
It's basically that idea that every single thing happening in our minds, every thought, every feeling is always about something, directed at something.
That's a good way to put it, yeah. Like whether you're picturing a unicorn in your head.
Or feeling sad about a breakup.
Exactly. There's always this aboutness to it, this pointing towards something. That's intentionality in a nutshell. And Brentano was adamant that this pointing, this aboutness, is what makes mental stuff different from physical stuff.
It's the defining feature, he'd say, of anything mental.
Exactly. And he went further, too. He grouped all these mental phenomena into, like, three main buckets: presentations, judgments, and the phenomena of love and hate. That last one's a mouthful. But it basically covers emotions and desires.
So like a taxonomy of mental stuff. And presentations are kind of the starting point, right? We got to have something in mind before we can make a judgment about it or feel anything towards it.
Right on. You're getting it. Presentations, judgments, feelings. That's Brentano's framework.
Okay. But then here's where Twardowski comes in and says, hold on, there's something a bit murky in Brentano's presentation talk.
Yeah, he saw this ambiguity that he thought caused some problems, especially with the whole judgment thing. Remember how Brentano talks about the object of a presentation?
Yeah, the thing the presentation is about.
Right. But he also uses this term, immanent object. And that's where things get a bit fuzzy. Because the immanent object is like the object as it exists within the mental act.
Oh, I see. So there's the actual thing out there in the world.
Right, like a tree.
And then there's how that tree shows up in my mind when I think about it.
Exactly. And Twardowski's like, hang on, this immanent object business leads to some tricky situations. And the Stanford Encyclopedia brings up this great example. Think about judging that, say, the ether doesn't exist.
Okay. Aether, that's
supposed medium that light waves were thought to travel through.
right. But it turned out not to be real. So how does that mess with Brentano's view?
Well, if we stick with this immanent object idea, the ether is kind of trapped inside my mind, right? Part of my mental act.
Okay.
But then when I say, hey, the ether doesn't exist, what am I actually denying? Am I denying the existence of something in my own head? Because that doesn't make sense, right? The thought is clearly there.
So it's like, if I'm denying the ether, there has to be something there to deny in the first place.
Exactly. And Twardowski recognized this tension. He knew this ambiguity in Brentano's theory needed some serious attention.
Okay. So fast forward to 1894. Twardowski publishes this really important work called On the Content and Object of Presentations.
Landmark stuff.
And this is where he tackles the problem head on. He argues that this phrase, the presented, it's being used in two totally different ways. And that's the root of the confusion.
Yeah, and getting those two ways sorted out is like his whole project.
Okay, lay it on us then. What's the big distinction, Twardowski breakthrough?
It boils down to this. Every single mental thing we do Every presentation, every judgment, every feeling has two parts. The content that's Inhalt in German and the object, the Gegenstand.
Content and object.
Yep. And here's the kicker. Our mental act, it's pointed at the object, not the content. That's crucial.
Let me see if I've got this. Content is how I'm thinking about something. It's my specific mental angle on it. And the object is the thing itself, what I'm thinking about.
You nailed it. That's the gist of it. Twardowski actually used this phrase from another philosopher, Robert Zimmerman. He said, the object is that which is presented, while the content is that through which the object is presented.
That's pretty helpful, yeah.
It's like the content is the lens, the object is what you're seeing through that lens. And, this whole thing, it's kind of similar to Frege's famous sense and reference distinction, but Twardowski was coming at it from a psychology perspective, not so much this abstract Platonic world of ideas.
More grounded in how our minds actually work. Okay, so can we have a real-world example here to make sure we're all on the same page?
Absolutely. Twardowski's favorite. Think about the Roman Juvavum and the birthplace of Mozart.
Roman what now?
It's an old Roman name.
Oh.
So both of these, Roman Juvavum and birthplace of Mozart, they're presentations, right?
Different ways of describing something.
Exactly. But they both point to the same object, Salzburg. The city of Salzburg.
Okay, so different descriptions, same thing in the world.
Yep. But the content of each presentation, that's what's different. One is showing you Salzburg through its ancient Roman history, and the other is highlighting its Mozart connection.
Same destination, different mental paths to get there.
Perfect analogy. And there's this even better one from the Stanford entry. Imagine an arrow.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
The object is what that arrow is pointing at, so in this case, Salzburg. The content is everything else about that arrow. The material, its shape, the fletching, the direction it's flying. It's like all those specifics of the arrow represent the different ways we can think about Salzburg. And the act of presenting is just that arrow being fired towards Salzburg.
So content is all the unique, individual stuff about my mental act. Object is the target, and it exists out there whether I'm thinking about it or not.
Right. Content depends on my mind and on me actively thinking about it. The object, well, Salzburg's going to keep being Salzburg, even if I'm asleep. But Twardowski also points out this cool twist. The content of one presentation can become the object of a different presentation.
Whoa, hold up. So presentations can be about other presentations.
Yep. Like if I stop and think about, how am I thinking about the Roman Juvavum right now?
So you're thinking about your own thinking.
Right. That initial presentation, the Roman Juvavum, that content, it becomes the object of my new second-order presentation. It's arrowception. Like my mind's arrow is pointing at another mental arrow.
Okay, that's getting pretty meta. I like it. So we've got this content object thing happening in the mind, but how did Twardowski connect this to how language works, to meaning?
Right. So he was very interested in how our thoughts, connect to words and sentences.
Naturally.
And for Twardowski, names are key here, like proper nouns, definite descriptions, think Barack Obama or the current president, things that point to something specific.
Okay, so names are like the linguistic version of presentations.
Right on. And he said names have 3 jobs to do. First, they tell you that someone is having a presentation in their mind.
So if I say Salzburg, you know I'm having a Salzburg thought.
Exactly. Second, a name means something. It has a, semantic content.
Like Salzburg means a specific city in Austria.
Yep. And third, it designates an object. It names or refers to that object.
And what did Twardowski think this meaning part of a name really was? What's going on there?
Well, at this point in his work, he had what we call a psychologistic view of meaning. Basically, he thought that the meaning of a name was just the content of the presentation that's happening in the speaker's mind.
So the meaning of apple for me is?
Whatever your mental picture of an apple is, your personal concept of it.
Okay, meaning as a mental thing. So how did all this help him tackle that super tricky problem of non-existent objects? We're talking like round, squares, that kind of stuff.
Yes. This is where his content-object distinction shines. He was bold, too. Straight up said, there's no such thing as an objectless presentation. Every presentation, no matter how bizarre the thing we're thinking about, it has both a content and an object.
Even if the object is, like, logically impossible.
Even then, the only difference is sometimes the object just doesn't actually exist in reality.
So even a round square, which can't possibly exist, it's still an object in my thought.
Exactly. It's the target of my presentation, even if the target is, well, impossible.
Mind blown.
And he used his 3 functions of names to back this up, like Take the phrase oblique square. It's gibberish, right? Those properties clash, so no such thing can exist.
Yeah.
But even so, that phrase, it designates something. There's something being pointed to, even if that something is nonsensical.
So it's picking out an object in the realm of thought, even if that object has no real-world counterpart. Clever. But what about, the idea that nothing is a kind of objectless presentation? Some philosophers, like Bolzano, argued for that, right?
Yeah, but Twardowski wasn't buying it. He said nothing isn't really a name, not in the way Salzburg is a name. It's more like a word that only makes sense when it's hanging out with other words like and or.
Like it doesn't refer to a thing all by itself.
Right. And since it's not a name, he said, it doesn't have to follow those three functions of names. So the whole question of its object, it just doesn't come up.
Like he sidestepped the whole issue. Clever.
Yeah.
And the Stanford entry even pointed out that this kind of foreshadowed, what's his name? Carnap's criticism of Heidegger's whole nothingness thing.
Yeah, Carnap basically said, you're talking about nothing as if it's a thing, but it's not a thing. And Twardowski's argument, it lines up with that.
Okay, that's a cool connection. So Twardowski was adamant that all presentations have objects. What else did he use to support that?
He looked at you could say the existence status of the whole presentation shebang, the act of presenting, its content, and its object. He pointed out that the act and the content, they're like joined at the hip, always exist together in the mind.
Okay, so my act of thinking and the specific way I'm thinking, those go together.
Exactly. But the object, it's a different story. It might exist out there in the world or it might not. So with our round square, the content, how I'm thinking about this crazy shape, that exists in my mind. But the round square itself, nope, doesn't exist. So when I say a round square doesn't exist, my denial is aimed at that non-existent object, not the existing mental content.
So the content is the vehicle, object is the destination, whether the destination exists or not. I like that.
Yeah, good way to put it.
Yeah.
He also made this distinction between being presented and actually existing.
Okay, there's a difference there, yeah.
And he argued that those who are, team objectless presentation, they're kind of blurring these two things together. Just because something pops up in my mind doesn't mean it has to exist independently.
No, so.
Plus, he made this sharp point. Contradictory properties, they always belong to the object, not the content of the presentation. Like, I can totally think about a round square, have a clear mental image of it without immediately noticing it's logically impossible.
Right, like it takes a second to be like, wait, that doesn't make sense.
Exactly. So if we were to say that presentations can only have possible objects, then weirdly, the presentation of a round square would have an object until the moment you realize it can't exist.
And then poof, it's gone.
Yeah, where'd the object go? Twardowski's point is it's always there, it's just an impossible object.
The object itself is messed up, not the presentation of it.
Okay. So to think about round squares, we need the object to be there, even if it's an impossible object.
Right, and the Stanford entry highlighted this key assumption in Twardowski's view. For him, object basically means anything capable of being the object of a presentation. Anything you can think about, anything you can name, has an object.
Okay, that makes sense, but I can see how that might be problematic. Oh, it definitely is. And later on, Bertrand Russell, famous logician, he challenged this whole idea with his theory of descriptions, but that's a whole other can of worms.
Noted. For another deep dive, perhaps.
Yeah, sure. But yeah, that's Twardowski's foundation. Everything has an object, even impossible things.
Okay. So we've gone deep on this content-object distinction, and it's clearly super important for understanding how we can even think about unreal stuff. But Twardowski didn't just stop there, right? The Stanford entry mentions his work on mereology, too.
Oh, yeah. Twardowski had his fingers in a lot of philosophical pies, and his thoughts on mereology, that's the study of parts and wholes, were pretty influential. In fact, Roman Ingarden,
So he was.
a student of Husserl, big name in phenomenology, he actually called Twardowski's mereology the first fully worked out theory of objects since, medieval times.
Wow, high praise.
It's debatable whether it was the first, Bolzano was doing some interesting stuff too, but it definitely marked a resurgence of interest in the whole Aristotelian metaphysics thing. Back to the roots, kinda.
Cool. So how did Twardowski approach parts and wholes?
Well, he had this really broad view of what counts as a part. Didn't limit it to just physical pieces of something. He divided parts into two types, material and formal.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
So material parts are the actual stuff that makes up a thing.
Thank you.
Think bricks in a house, the red pigment in an apple, the concrete
Well,
components.
that's pretty straightforward. What about the formal ones?
Formal parts are all about relations, relations between an object and its material parts, or relations between the material parts themselves.
So if we're talking about a table,
Yeah, the legs would be material parts, the wood they're made of, all that.
and would, like, the fact that those legs are attached to the tabletop, would that be a formal part? Because about how the pieces relate to each other.
You got it. That would be a primary formal part, a relation between the whole table and one of its legs. And a secondary formal part would be, say, the spatial relation between two legs, like how far apart they are.
Okay, I'm starting to see how this all fits together.
And he went on to define matter as just the sum of all the material parts, and form as the sum of all the formal parts. Interesting thing, though. For Twardowski, properties, like the table being wooden or the apple being red, those are considered a special kind of primary formal part.
Wait, so a property is a relation.
Well, yeah, in a way. It's the relation between the object as a whole and one of its material parts. So redness is a formal part because it's the relation between the apple and its red pigment.
Okay, I never thought about properties like that before. That's really interesting. And I'm guessing his content-object distinction probably shows up here too, right?
Of course, it's like the backbone of his whole philosophy.
So how does it play out in Mariology?
Well, it let him distinguish between, like, thinking about the parts of the object itself versus thinking about the parts of my presentation of the object.
Okay, so there are parts in the world.
And then there's how those parts show up in my mind.
Right. And he has special terms for these, didn't he?
Yep. He called the parts of a presentation's content elements. And the parts of the object that are actually presented, highlighted through those elements, he called those characteristic marks.
Okay, give me an example.
Imagine looking at a wooden table, right? The individual grain patterns in the wood, those are material parts of the object, but they only become characteristic marks if you're actually focusing on them, consciously noticing those specific grain patterns.
So they got to be actively represented in my mind, in the content of my perception, to count as characteristic marks.
Right. If you're just glancing at the table, those green patterns, they might be there, but they're not part of what you're actively presenting to yourself.
So it's not just about what's physically there, it's about what's mentally present, what's being highlighted. Got it.
And this leads to another big idea Twardowski took from Bolzano. He argued that because the number of parts in any object is, well, potentially infinite, we can never have a truly complete, totally adequate presentation of anything. We're finite beings, so we can only grasp a limited number of characteristic marks at any given time.
So there's always more to know, always more to see. Our understanding is always going to be partial.
Exactly. It's a fundamental limit. And then he took this even further, distinguishing between metaphysical, physical, and logical parts. But unlike Brentano, who focused on whether these parts actually exist independently in the world, Twardowski based his distinction on how we present these parts. Can we separate them in our minds, or are they always linked?
Okay, walk me through that.
Mhm.
What's the difference between those three types?
So you can't have a presentation of, say, red all by itself without also presenting color. They come as a package deal, mentally speaking. That's a logical part. They're one-sidedly inseparable in content.
So red always implies color, can't have one without the other in my mind.
Exactly. But you can think about the pages of a book without also thinking about its cover. They're mentally separable, so those would be physical parts.
Got it. Different levels of connectedness in how we think about parts. And what about metaphysical parts?
Those are like super intertwined. Think of the color and the shape of, say, a red ball. You can conceptually distinguish them, but you can't really have a presentation of the color without also presenting the shape. They're mutually inseparable, even if we can analyze them as distinct aspects of the object itself.
Okay, that's pretty deep, but makes sense. So that's a glimpse into his Mariology. But the Stanford entry also talks about how his thinking developed later on, especially during his time in Lvov. He didn't just stay put with content and object, right?
Oh, no, he kept going. Developed some really sophisticated ideas about truth, the relationship between language and meaning, even ethics, always building on those earlier insights.
Always refining, deepening. That's cool. Let's stick with truth for a minute. The entry talks about his work on the so-called relative truths. What was he getting at there?
Well, back then, relativism about truth was getting popular. Like the idea that truth depends on your perspective, your culture, all that.
Oh, yeah. Truth is relative. You hear that a lot.
Right. And Twardowski, he pushed back hard against that. He was team absolute truth all the way.
So he thought there is a truth of the matter, regardless of who's looking at it.
Exactly. And he made this important distinction. Truth and falsity, They're properties of judgments, not of sentences.
Hang on, what's the difference?
Well, judgments are like the mental act of affirming or denying something. It's what's happening in your mind. Sentences are just the words we use to express those judgments.
Okay, so there's the thought itself, and then there's the way we put that thought into language.
Precisely. And Twardowski's point was sentences can be ambiguous. They can depend on context. They can leave stuff out. But the judgments themselves, those are what are truly true or false.
Okay, I think I see where you're going with this. So if I say, it's raining here and now,
Yeah, that seems relative to where you are and when you're saying it. But Twardowski would argue that your underlying judgment is actually about a very specific place and time.
like Lvov at 3:15 p.m. on this particular day.
Right. And the truth of that judgment is fixed. It's either raining in Lvov at that exact time or it's not.
So he's saying we can eliminate the apparent relativity by spelling everything out, making all the context explicit.
Exactly. He called this eternalizing a sentence. Take your "it's raining" example. The fully eternalized version would be something like, on March 26, 2025, at 3:05 p.m. in Lvov, it is raining.
Way more specific, yeah.
And that statement is definitively true or false, no matter who's saying it or when. He even invented this term omnitemporal truth to describe this. If a judgment is true at one point in time, it's true at all times.
Wow. So appearances can be deceiving. What seems relative might actually be absolutely true or false once we flesh out all the details.
That's the heart of his argument, yeah. It's the sentence that's relative, not the judgment itself.
So he was saving truth from the relativists. Okay, that's truth. What about his views on meaning? Did he stick with that psychologistic view he had in content and object? The idea that meaning is just whatever's in your head.
He actually moved away from that a bit, yeah. Under the influence of, you guessed it, Husserl.
Of course. Big influence on everyone back then.
Can't escape him. So Twardowski shifted towards what he called an Aristotelian view of meaning, more objective, less about what's going on in individual minds. And his 1912 work, Actions and Products, that's where he really lays out this change.
Okay, so what's this all about? Actions and products, meaning.
So the key is this distinction between actions or activities and their products. Like running is the action, the run is the product. Judging is the action, the judgment is the product.
Okay, so there's the doing and then there's the result of the doing.
Exactly. And he argued that if we carefully separate the act of judging, which is a psychological event happening in time, from the judgment as a product, which is more like a proposition or a content,
Okay.
then we can draw a clearer line between psychology and logic.
So psychology studies the act of judging, logic studies the judgment itself.
Precisely. And he basically said that this judgment product, it's the same as the content of judgment from his earlier work.
So tying back to content and object. Nice.
Right. And he pointed out that these mental products, like judgments in the logical sense, they're not permanent things. They happen in the mind, then they're gone.
Ephemeral, yeah.
Exactly. But they can be like preserved or expressed in more lasting ways, like in a spoken sentence or a written sentence.
So my thought that the sky is blue, that flashes through my mind and then disappears. But I can write down the sky is blue and make it, more permanent.
You got it. And he saw this as a two-step process. First, you have the mental judgment. Then it gets turned into a spoken sentence.
From thought to sound.
Yep. And then, from the spoken sentence, it can get turned into a written sentence. And for a sentence to actually have meaning, to be able to communicate a judgment, it needs to be able to evoke a similar judgment in someone else's mind.
Right, the listener has to be able to get it.
Mm-hmm.
So how did he define meaning then, if it wasn't just about what's in the individual's head anymore?
Well, he came up with this concept of unique meaning. It's a bit abstract, but basically.
Hit me with it.
He said the unique meaning of a word or a sentence is like an abstraction of all the common features that show up in all the different mental judgments that word or sentence can trigger.
Okay, so it's not tied to any one person's mind, but it's like this shared thing that emerges from how lots of different people understand the word.
Exactly. He was moving towards a more objective, less individualistic view of meaning. Although how this all fits with Husserl's idealism, that's still something philosophers debate today.
Always more to figure out. And the entry also mentioned substitutive judgments in his later work. What are those all about?
Yes. Those tie back to the presented judgments he talked about in content and object. So in Actions and Products, he connected this to how logicians work. He said that when a logician uses an example like all triangles are squares, They're not actually judging that to be true.
Because, well, it's obviously not.
Right. They're just presenting that judgment as a hypothetical, a kind of placeholder to explore the logical relationship.
So it's like a thought experiment.
Exactly.
Hmm.
And he called these substitutive judgments or fictitious judgments, their meanings are like sticulated, made up for the sake of logical analysis.
Playing with ideas, seeing how they fit together, even if the ideas themselves are false. That's interesting.
And he gave credit to Bolzano for influencing him on this, too. It shows how logic can deal with abstract forms and relations, even when the content is totally bonkers.
So even false statements can be logically useful.
Exactly. And it all goes back to that content-object distinction, because these substitutive judgments, they still have objects, even if those objects are just made up.
Twardowski was consistent, that's for sure. So zooming out a bit, it's clear that Twardowski was a philosophical powerhouse. Went way beyond that initial content-object distinction.
Oh, for sure. In his work, it was always so precise, so rigorous, so clear. And he wasn't just a lone wolf. He founded the Lvov-Warsaw School, which became massively influential.
Yeah, shaping a whole generation of philosophers.
And his approach, that focus on careful analysis, on tackling specific problems in a systematic way, that was a big part of his legacy.
So bringing it all home, Twardowski's distinction between content and object, it's not just a footnote in philosophy. It has major implications for understanding how our minds work, how meaning works, how we can even think about things that aren't real.
It's foundational, really. It gives us a way to analyze those connections between our minds and the world and how language fits into all of that. And his work bridges these different areas of philosophy, psychology, logic, metaphysics. He was all about connecting the dots.
Yeah, he was a big picture thinker who also loved getting into the details. So to leave you, our listeners, with something to ponder,
Yeah.
think about how this content-object distinction might play out in your understanding of the world. When you're grappling with complex ideas,